Do you want me to stand at the lectern and moderate from there? What would you prefer?
The lectern, well then if you
Oh,
want
so
to,
then I can't.
you can also,
I just want to have a big enough mic.
and
They might need to come up and use them, so let's sit down. And then they yeah, because
there's no
smoke like that. Then they might want to come, okay, they might want to come up and do their own then. What have we asked for? Perfect, okay. That sounds great. And are they going to be recording?
They are.
They are. So we're going to tell us when you're ready to go.
Okay. So my positions. Okay. She's not looking. Is that okay? Can I just have
You can then sounds great. Now I'm going to listen to
Alip? Who's going to stand here? Someone's going to stand here?
Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome to what promises to be a fascinating session, deploying a broad portfolio of technology solutions to advance energy transition and decarbonization. I have a wonderful group of expert panelists here with me this evening. My name is Amanda Ellis, and I lead global partnerships for the ASU Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. And I'm thrilled to have at the far end of the table Peter Schlosser, who is our Vice President and Vice Provost. Now, next to Peter, Brian Vasjo is the President and CEO of Capital Power, which operates both in the US and in Canada. And then to his right is Katja Dinges, who is the Associate Director of Guidehouse and leading consultancy on energy, climate and infrastructure, also doing some very interesting work with the German government that she will tell us about. Next to Katja is Brendan Wallace, who is the co-founder and managing partner of Fifth Wall. And finally, last but not least, to my left is Brian Vasjo. Oh, sorry, no, I have now messed up, haven't I? Because I have not introduced Kolia Kuza, who is the chairman of the board at E5 and also the CEO of Techno Carbon Technology. So fantastic to have such an illustrious panel with us. And of course, this is a critical topic. We're all here at COP27 and we're looking for solutions to see if we can possibly manage to get back towards a realistic 1.5 degree temperature rise. And I'm wearing a flower in the honor of the islands who are most impacted, of course, by what is happening currently. And we're looking forward to hearing from our panel of experts today on how we really can deploy this broad technology, this broad portfolio of technology solutions. Now, Peter, I see you're first on my list to start, and you're going to tell us a little bit about the Centre for Negative Carbon Emissions at ASU and some of the technologies that we hope can help make 1.5 a reality.
Okay, yeah, now it should work. Just to put everything a bit into context, we are of course here at COP27, which is about climate. So let's just connect climate and energy together. In essence, we have the climate problem not as a root cause of itself, but because we are using, too many people are using too much energy from the wrong source, from fossil fuels. That actually then leads to an outcome, or several negative outcomes. One of them, a major one, is climate, which is global warming. So as we are considering the technology that we need to combat global warming, or to keep global warming at as low as possible, below 2, or as close as possible to 1.5. Personally, I believe 1.5 is no longer reachable, although it was highly desirable that we should get there. We have to look at what kind of technologies do we have available to transform the energy system so that we can get away from fossils as fast as possible. And we have actually timelines laid out for us by the Paris Accord, by IPCC 1.5, that say that we need in essence two major components. One is cutting emissions by half by 2030. We are quite a bit behind that trajectory. That then should go to close to zero by the middle of the century. Maybe there's always a discussion about the last 20%. But the second major component that we have to put in place is to take some of the CO2 back out of the atmosphere, typically called negative emissions. For that, we typically look at two pathways. One is using nature, the so-called nature-based solutions. It's a very simple concept. In essence, we are increasing biomass on the planet. The second one is a technical solution, often called direct air capture, and that is putting devices into the atmosphere that can absorb the CO2, and then you concentrate it, and then you either use it or you dispose of it. So these are actually the pathways that we have in front of us. Just very quickly, in my view, where we're standing, I think we know in principle what to do. We know the fundamentals of these technologies. Where we are behind the curve is in the pace at which we are scaling up these technologies. And that, I think, is something that leads us to climate finance, to regulations, to politics, to actually all the mechanisms that have to come together, private sector, venture capital, that have to come together to really go from where we are right now, which is really small pilots that have shown that we can do it, to a scale where at 2050 we are able to roughly take back out of the atmosphere 20 gigatons of carbon. That is about 50% of what we are emitting today. So these are big numbers based on our forward projections, on our modeling, on our insight into the engineering of it, into the biology of it. We should be able to do it, but we are not at a level of implementation that would get us onto the trajectory we have to be on. So that's how I see it. I think we are not limited at that point by scientific or engineering insight. We are limited by translation into scale.
Thank you so much, Peter. Now I'm going to ask the gentleman to my left, who is Polya Kuza, to tell us a little bit about his initiative.
I need this one.
Oh, you can see him there, okay.
Okay,
Next slide.
I'm going to go a little bit more into practice now. I want to talk about a German-funded government. It's called a project by the German government. Its name is CDR Terra, carbon dioxide removal on terrestrial surfaces. There is a co-project called CDR Mare, but that's another thing I don't want to talk about today. And CDR Terra consists of 10 sub-projects, and one of them is called DACUS. It's called Direct Air Capture, Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Safe Storage. And it's led by a German institution responsible for the development of carbon fibers. Some prestigious other partners are in that consortium, for example, DLR, University of Hamburg, University of Munich, Technical University of Munich, and Carbon Collect as an associate partner. Carbon Collect technology was developed at ASU. Peter Schlosser was talking about earlier, capturing air carbon dioxide. So here you can see the mechanical tree that was developed by Mr. Lackner at the Arizona State University, which is collecting air and on a very low level of energy, the CO2 can be filtered from air, and you take that CO2 and
Sorry.
bring it into a glass house. We grow algae from the CO2, and the algae is turning the CO2 into oils, and we can extract from these oils the base materials for making of the carbon fiber. Next one. And from these carbon fibers, in combination with granite, we can make structural beams. I have brought one of these parts here that you can see. This is pure stone with a little bit of carbon fibers captured from air and transformed via the algae. This is a bio-based solution. The stone is not being smashed or ground or treated. It's just cut as it is, because the crystal structure of nature is doing a fantastic job. It's 2 times lighter. You can see it. You can feel it. It's 2 times lighter than the same piece of steel, at the same properties and the same performance. So we are capturing carbon in the carbon fiber. We are capturing carbon in the stone dust that is the waste from making the stone slabs. Stone has a very high capacity to store carbon in addition. And within the project Douglas, we are making a house wall, like you can see on the banner here. And in between 2 stone slabs, which are stabilized by the fiber, we will put biochar. And this will have 3 measures to make this building material CO2 negative to a large extent. Next slide, please. Yeah, here you can see the house wall again on the screen. It will be tested, and within the framework of this project, we will get certification to use that in buildings. Thank you.
Absolutely terrific. I'm going to ask you what it will take us, as per Peter's question, to really go to scale, because this is just very exciting. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Brendan, great to hear from you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm Brendan Wallace. I am the co-founder of Fifth Wall. Fifth Wall is the largest venture capital fund focused on decarbonizing the built environment, which we think of as broadly real estate and construction. And I thought I'd just mention why I think that's such an important part of the economy to decarbonize, because when you think of the most responsible industries in climate change, typically people think of transportation or manufacturing or agriculture. But most people don't recognize that real estate is actually the single largest industry contributor of CO2. So real estate in the United States is about 13% of US GDP. And yet it's 40% of US CO2 emissions. About 29% of that comes from just operating buildings, heating, cooling, lighting buildings. And about 11% comes from building them in the first place. And one of the really interesting statistics that we found, which was kind of the premise for us starting our first climate fund, was that if you looked at venture capital, so where the capital is flowing into new technology, only about 6% of venture capital going into climate goes into technologies that are relevant for the real estate industry. The vast majority goes today into transportation, into agriculture, into manufacturing. So to put that very simply, you have 40% of the problem getting about 6% of the solution. And there's kind of an added complexity in the real estate industry, which is that because it's such a diffuse industry, it's very granular, there's very little concentrated ownership in real estate, it's very hard to create the incentives to create a Tesla, for example, of real estate. And what Fifth Wall did is we pooled together the largest real estate organizations across the world. We had them all contribute capital to a single fund where their individual contributions were quite small, but in aggregate we raised, our first fund was $500 million, and we're raising a multiple of that now. And all of that capital is going into the technologies to help decarbonize the real estate industry. And so it's the largest pool of capital for this particular sector. And I think as we kind of explored, why is this such an imminent opportunity from not just an altruistic climate perspective, but also commercially and economically. In the US, it's estimated that to retrofit all of the commercial assets, if you were to take every single commercial building in the United States today and make it true operational carbon zero, the cost would be $18 trillion, Morgan Stanley estimates. The United States GDP is $21 trillion. And so if you expect that we're going to have to decarbonize our buildings, because that's where 40% of emissions are coming from, that roughly means we're going to have to spend 1 year of US GDP over the next 20 just retrofitting our buildings with materials like this, and more efficient heating systems, and more efficient lighting systems, and motors. And so what our hope is that our funds can be a catalyst to help accelerate and commercialize technology to help decarbonize this single most contributive industry, real estate. And so that's a little bit on Fifth Wall and who we are.
Absolutely terrific. And here we're seeing some very practical solutions. The technology is happening, and then of course capital, as Peter pointed out, is such a critical dimension of this. Love the idea that you were able to pool the funds so that there was a relatively small contribution, but $500 million is very impressive as a first raise. So congratulations, thank you on that foresight. Now, coming to you, Katja, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the work that you're doing, both consultancy and cooling.
Thank you, Amanda. I will speak about deploying sustainable cooling technology and give you a preview, a little bit context first. So, Guidehouse is leading a large program called Cool Up, Upscaling Sustainable Cooling in the MENA region. It's part of the International Climate Initiative, which is financed by the German government. So cooling constitutes a major source of energy consumption in the MENA region. So the Cool Up program promotes accelerated technology change to reduce cooling demand, and also promotes the early implementation of Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol to support the phase down of hydrofluorocarbon. So our focus is on commercial refrigeration and air conditioning in residential and commercial sector. We have a really multifaceted approach. You can also see here the different pillars we have. And apart from the capacity building, awareness raising measures, and also a broad stakeholder engagement process where we work closely together with policymakers, financial institutions, Federation of Industries, and also the local manufacturers, we have three main pillars. The one is policy support, where we also support governments in implementation of Paris Agreement and Kigali Amendment, through supporting them in developing suitable strategies related to cooling, also developing codes and standards for appliances and in the built environment. For the financial sector, we develop financial models that boost sustainable cooling technology, and in the technical one, we recently have elaborated a catalog of technology considering here energy efficiency solutions, combined also with the use of renewable energy and the use of natural refrigerant, which is important also to reduce the direct emission that comes from refrigerants. So the program also is supplemented by setting up a really strong implementation oriented industry partnership, and also training and capacity building with the private sector. And this is what I will bring in the discussion here on the panel today, the private sector perspective on deploying sustainable cooling to advance the energy transition.
Thank you so much. And of course, there's a feedback loop. As the planet gets warmer, there's a higher demand for air conditioning. So it's fantastic to see that you're actually addressing this and also thinking about the Montreal Protocol. And being from New Zealand originally, the ozone layer was a huge problem when I was growing up. And so it's one of the big successes of the international community that we were able to come up with the Montreal Protocol and see that ozone layer begin to close. And of course, there's also the ongoing issues related to the Paris Accords. So wonderful. And I previously ran the New Zealand Development Agency, so I'm also very pleased to see the financing from the German government, seeing that development agencies can help provide financing to developing countries so that they're able to then hopefully scale up. And then of course we have Brian's fund, sorry, I have a friend who looks very much like you, his name is Brian, so Brendan's fund that is then able to scale in the private sector. So we're seeing a tremendous amount of interlocking solutions on this wonderful panel. So now, if I could move to the speaker to hear more.
Thank you very much, and very pleased to be here today, and especially with this panel, because as you say, things are very much interlocking, and certainly, you know, as a power producer, and actually a significant amount of thermal generation, direct air capture is something that we're looking at to cover a significant amount of emissions that we wouldn't be able to get to utilizing, you know, other technology. We actually are investing very heavily in carbon nanotube production, which utilizes flue gas and creates carbon nanotubes, which are used to reinforce building materials. But you know what I'm here to talk about today is some immediate action that we're taking around reducing emissions from natural gas generation, actually ultimately from coal generation, and going through a transition where we're going to end up with relatively low emission power generation from carbon capture and storage. And so I have a short video to demonstrate this technology.
The energy transition is upon us as we tackle climate change globally. Alberta, Canada is a hub of innovation and at the heart of this transition, exemplifying the leadership, government support, and industry collaboration needed to support the transition to a decarbonized energy future. In Alberta's industrial heartland, Capital Power's Genesee Generating Station, located west of Edmonton, has provided reliable baseload coal generation for decades and is now undergoing a $1.2 billion transformation to move off, utilize best-in-class natural gas technology from Mitsubishi, and deploy storage. This project will be followed by carbon capture and sequestration investments to further reduce emissions and optimize the facility to continue to provide flexible, dispatchable power for decades to come. Currently under construction, the repowering of Genesee units 1 and 2 results in the most efficient combined cycle natural gas units in the country. They will utilize significant existing generation infrastructure, resulting in a 1.4 million ton reduction in CO2 relative to 2019 emissions, representing a 60% reduction despite a 40% increase in installed capacity of firmware power. The high efficiency of these units will also result in displacement of less efficient units, resulting in 1 million tons of additional emission reductions on Alberta's ground. The project includes up to 210 megawatts of battery storage capacity. Capital Power is also in advanced stages of engineering to deploy carbon capture and sequestration on the repowered units. This is a $2 billion investment in one of the largest projects of its kind in the world, expected to capture up to 3 million tons of CO2 per year. The project is currently pursuing indigenous participation. The final investment decision expected summer of 2024. At a high level, the post-combustion carbon capture and sequestration process involves capturing flue gas from the repowered units and circulating through a down-flowing amine solution. The proprietary amine solvent from Mitsubishi then absorbs CO2 from the flue gas. A amine solvent returns to a regenerator and uses heat from steam to release the absorbed CO2. The CO2 is then dehydrated and compressed for pipeline transportation. CO2 will be transported and sequestered through the Enbridge Longman Open Access Hub, one of the project's awarded rights in early 2022 as part of the Alberta government's carbon capture and sequestration development process. The hub is approximately 10 kilometers from the Genesee Generating Station. Capital Power is targeting the commencement of sequestration in late 2027. Enbridge has partnered with industrial leaders like Capital Power and Lehigh Cement to utilize their hub, as well as partnering with First Nation Capital Investment Partnership to ensure the local indigenous communities in Alberta have an ownership stake in the project. This application of carbon capture and sequestration showcases technology that both the Alberta and Canadian governments have acknowledged as essential to achieving decarbonization and leverage the programs that governments are putting in place to accelerate its deployment. Together, the Genesee Generating Station repowering and carbon capture and sequestration projects represent an expected 6.4 million ton reduction in CO2 emissions, making the facility a near zero emitting source of reliable energy and system support services in Alberta's grid that will be essential as renewable generation levels continue to increase. Capital Power is demonstrating an all-of-the-above approach to decarbonization through its Genesee Generating Station transformation, growing renewables portfolio, and support for critical technologies. Capital Power is one such example. Power Alberta and Canada are on the leading edge of an energy transition, and taking action today to create a sustainable energy future that will support generations to come.
Fascinating, and I think that does really represent the multi-stakeholder coalition collaboration that is so often encouraged. Interesting to recall that last year out of Glasgow, the text changed from phase out coal and fossil fuel subsidies to phase down unabated coal and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. I think it was a last minute entry from India and China. So interesting, Brian, to see the work that you're doing. Obviously, you're making sure that all of your coal emissions are abated at source. And there was a really fascinating piece of new technology that I think you're all going to want to look at that was launched by Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, and Al Gore a couple of days ago, called Climate Trace. And it will in fact allow real-time, the trace is tracking real-time climate emissions. And it's a consortium of 100 big AI companies with satellites and machine learning, including some of our own at ASU. And this allows a range of different data sets, so from pollution, from plumes, to heat data, and I think it'll be very useful to be able to check emissions. It does go down to emissions at the facility level, and it is fascinating for me to see number 327 in the world is a rice field that's emitting methane in China. So really going to be very interesting for all of you to be tracking that, because as we know at the moment with nationally determined contributions, there's only self-disclosure, and there's been a patchwork of means of looking at emissions otherwise, but I think this is going to be very relevant for all of us. So turning now to Peter, wanting to ask you a question about the role of universities in global decarbonisation. And we've already heard a little bit about that from Collier, but love to hear more from you about what role you think universities can play.
Well, there are many aspects to that question, but in general, universities or academia as a whole, actually, including research institutions, are society's primary knowledge generator. So if it comes down to existential questions such as the future of our planet, including climate, including new energy systems that will actually work for keeping global warming at a certain level, there is an obligation by universities to work on methods, produce the knowledge that can lead to technologies that can help us to transform the energy system, to find new ways to build, to think about issues such as the carbon removal, direct air capture, but also in relationship to nature-based solutions. And if we are looking at the negative emissions, direct air capture, that was actually one example of where universities gave produced the idea, demonstrated it can be done, and now it is handed off to commercial entities that really have to do the scaling. So in a very simple way, I often like to look at universities as the idea space. Increasingly, they move from idea space to also capture the solution space, thinking about solution-oriented research and how you can take ideas into an area where you actually can make use of them. Then you have the transformation space. So you really have, it doesn't help us if we have all that knowledge within universities, it has to be transmitted. And then if you go to the implementation, that's where universities might have a guiding role or a consumptive role, but that's really where the private sector has to pick up. We cannot scale out of universities. So that's really what is typically happening. If you're looking at direct air capture and you just take some of the ones that are widely known, Climeworks, that came out of ETH. If we're looking at carbon engineering, came out of Harvard. Before that, Mellon and a Canadian university. And if we're looking at global thermostat, that came out of Columbia, which is actually a place, Columbia University, the place where Klaus Lackner for the first time really showed that we can re-extract CO2 from the atmosphere. That was something that when the idea came up, when he proposed that, for years and years, he was actually almost looked at as an outcast in academia because people said that's completely crazy. And they literally wrote that in letters. This is crazy because you cannot beat entropy, meaning once you have distributed a gas, you cannot concentrate it anymore without spending more energy than if it costs to disperse it. So, but universities have to offer that space, that protection to follow these ideas until they are ready to be picked up and until they are ready to be upscaled by the outside. And that is where we are strong on the one hand, but at the same time, given the urgency and the time, the pace at which this has to happen, we also have weak points. That's where academia has to become much more nimble, much more focused on the application of the knowledge rather than just the idea generation and the translation into the space where it can be picked up. And we saw quite a few examples by those who are really then using it for building materials, concrete, etc.
And in fact, that's a perfect segue, Peter, into my next question to Collier, which is, how is the E5 business model proving itself in the European space? And I see you've actually added the carbon fiber for us to look at here.
Yes, we have been analyzing with German academia that we can utilize any CO2 or any carbon, form of carbon, to turn this into decarbon fiber. And we have made this from the algae oil from the Technical University of Munich, and we can prove, or it was measured, that this carbon fiber has had the same properties than those made of fossil oil. So typically, carbon fiber is made from fossil oil. Now we can make it via different chemical routes from any source, like methane, CO2. We can take any CO2, we can sequester CO2. If some of the gas should not be pumped in the earth, we can take it and convert it into carbon fibers. So that is something that was sponsored by the German government. So we need governmental help. This was initially it was an idea, and then we could prove it works.
Very exciting to see how you have the idea generation, and you mentioned carbon collect. We also have a mechanical tree up on campus, and Peter referencing that Klaus was the scientist that everybody thought was crazy, which reminds us of Nelson Mandela. It's always impossible until it's done. And it requires brilliant brains like those on the panel today who have foresight as to what could be a new kind of model. So very exciting to see that work coming out of academia, being supported by government, and just look at the amazing work that you're doing. Brilliant. And now coming to you, Brendan, you've been a visionary as well with creating this new fund, and would love to hear more about how Fifth Wall's unique approach to partnering with corporates is helping advance your investment strategies.
Yeah, so I think the point you just made about all of these new technologies, just to highlight, I think, how critical it is and how much the world is betting on these new technologies to be funded and to be commercialized. Today, for the real estate industry, if any owner wanted to decarbonize a building, brand new construction, and they were to deploy all the best technologies at the materials level, at a systems level into that asset would only get about halfway towards operational carbon zero. So about half of the stuff, half of the technology that we need to exist doesn't yet exist, or at least is not yet commercially viable. And that is the role that venture capital typically plays in an economy, certainly in and around innovation and intellectual property. It's designed to put capital into companies that are higher risk, that might not yet have commercialized, to enable them to prove out their tech and make it viable and make it sellable and build their customer base. And that actually informed how we built the fund. So we saw that a lot of companies, climate tech businesses, struggle with getting distribution. So they build fantastic technology, but they need to de-risk that someone is going to buy it at scale. And so what we did is we brought in these very large owners and operators and developers of real estate, who are definitionally the largest customers of the technology we were investing in. And we forced them effectively to invest in our fund in order to get access to these technologies. So these are huge real estate firms that you're probably all familiar with, firms like CBRE and Related and British Land and Hilton and MGM. All of them are trying to identify these new technology solutions. And by virtue of investing in our fund, we built this really high trust, really interactive relationship with them where we understood what are the pain points, what are the solutions they're looking for, and then we could map that to what we're seeing in the innovation economy and new solutions. And we could also capitalize those businesses. So in many ways, what we're trying to do is kind of build an ecosystem where we can provide capital to entrepreneurs that have great solutions to decarbonize the economy, and at the same time, connect them to very large customers who can de-risk those products from an adoption perspective and provide those forward purchase agreements that are so critical.
Brilliant model. And that brings me to Katja. How is it, Katja, that you're seeing the original investment by government in this cooling technology how are you envisaging that being able to go to scale?
What we see in our project is that the market for sustainable cooling technology is ready, at least in terms of capability, technological know-how, and also willingness from the manufacturer. Depends certainly a little bit on size of companies, what is the market share, what is the export share, and also how they work together, or what are the R&D capability in cooperation with university or inside the companies. But the manufacturers are already experienced with transitioning to new technologies and also switching refrigerants as a response of previous policies and strategies. For example, Montreal Protocol, Amanda, you mentioned before, also with the phase down of ozone-depleting substances. So they are experienced with that shift and transition of sustainable cooling technology to new technologies. So most manufacturers in our cooler countries, that is Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey and Jordan, export their equipment to the region as well as to the global market. And since globally or at EU level, certain policies and strategies and regulations are in place that calls or requires more energy efficient solutions and the phase down of hydrochlorocarbon, they are reacting on that and also started to working on having more sustainable cooling technologies in place or available to match the global market. But it's still to say that these technologies are still in a demonstration or pre-commercial phase. And to act as a proof of concept, also to test the readiness of these technologies, several demonstration projects have been implemented just to test these new technologies. So just to give you some example, using CO2 systems in refrigeration for larger supermarkets, or using ammonia or water for district cooling systems, or also for the split unit that is more common for the air conditioning using propane. And these technologies really have proven their reliability and also have shown a significant decrease in energy consumption. So the technology is there, but it's still a challenge to upscale these technologies in the market.
Thank you so much. Brian, I'd love to turn to you now to ask you if you could compare what is happening in Canada, which has a price on carbon, versus the US, where there's a lot of talk now about the package of incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act. And given that you operate in both the US and in Canada, could you give us some insights into how the two different policy regimes and different sets of incentives work?
So there is definitely a difference in policy structure between Canada and the United States, and depending on the initiative or what you're looking at, it does drive different behaviors and certainly different outcomes. What we're seeing is on the renewables front, basically both countries are extremely positive in terms of supporting renewable development, but in different ways. When it looks at elements like carbon capture and storage, certainly what's happening in Canada is much more supportive than what has been evolving in the United States. But it's actually becoming not needing too much more support from the United States or state governments to move a number of projects forward. So do see that you'll see a lot of carbon capture and storage, and actually direct air capture is getting a tremendous amount of attention in the United States as well. In fact, I was mentioning a technology that we are investing in. It's actually one of the Carbon X Prize finalists on direct air capture that's taking place right now, and that drive to commercialize taking carbon out of the air and creating these carbon nanotubes is getting a lot of attention. And it was a technology that came out of George Washington University, and we are supporting the commercial. In fact, we will be the commercialization agent for that technology when it comes to fruition, with some support from the Canadian and the Alberta government. And just to put another plug into universities, we actually sponsor 2 chairs at the University of Alberta. Absolutely agree, that's an amazing resource for universities to help move forward a lot of these technologies, and to actually to come up with the actual thinking behind the technologies, the brilliance behind some of these. And certainly when we think of collaboration, it's governments, industry, and absolutely academia as well.
Thank you. That was a wonderful summary. And I just come back from Iceland, where it was very interesting to see side by side at the geothermal plant where there's about 5% of CO2 as a byproduct, that they are actually capturing that, and through a company called CarbFix, they're sequestering it in the very specific geological formation that there is in basalt, and then it turns into pyrite and carbonate and is then permanently sequestered within, they estimate a 2-year period. So it's fascinating to see that happening. And then right next door, so you've got the carbon capture and storage, and then right next door you've got Climeworks, which is using direct air capture and the geothermal energy. So of course I started thinking, we have geothermal in New Zealand, we have it in Hawaii where I live, how might we replicate? So it is very exciting to see these different kinds of technologies and the opportunity that there is to scale them. So it's been terrific having such a variety of players across the value chain here. So I wanted to go next to ask each of you if you could give us an idea about the horizon for global decarbonization. And I'm going to start with you, Peter. What do you think business, government, civil society, all of the multi-stakeholders should be doing? And what do you see as the obstacles and opportunities? And I'm going to give everybody the same question, so you can answer this from your own area of expertise. And you can also take it from a bigger picture. But really, this is a critical time. We have 7.5 years, slightly less, left in terms of the 2030 agenda, tipping points. I get so frightened every time I hear climate scientists talk, and very excited when I'm on a panel like this with innovators like you who are really creating the solutions and creating opportunities out of obstacles in many ways. So Peter, give us your perspective on this question to start.
Well, from the highest level, society has to accept that this is an issue and that we are under time pressure, and that we have to actually, take the ideas into action and scale it up. And that includes both the what we discussed about the negative emissions, but then more fundamentally, getting off CO2 emissions, we have to actually transform the energy production from fossils to renewables. So the exponential increase of renewables has to continue at the pace that it's right now or more, so that by roughly 2050 we get 80-90% of the energy from solar and wind. And that,
Peter, what's the mix right now? Is it about 10% renewables? What's the global mix?
globally it's around 10%, but with large variations from area to area. And so we really, it's actually not quite there. It's below 10 still. So we have to continue to build that up. We have to make sure that we, coming back then to what we take back out of the atmosphere, because even if we get to emission zero, we have overshot in terms of the concentrations in the atmosphere already. We have to take some of the CO2 back out. We cannot simply put it away as, well, we could, but it would be not very wise to just put it away as waste. But we have to figure out how to maximize the fraction of CO2 that is really extracted from the atmosphere in use, in a use portfolio. The highest potential probably is synthetic fuel, but there is concrete, there are composites, there are all kinds of areas where we can add up small pieces. So we have to utilize each idea that we can, each way to use the CO2 that comes back out of the atmosphere or is captured from point sources into goods that have a long lifetime, such as what we see in front of us here. So I think that these factors have to come together, and then of course underlying all of that is that we have to find the financing structures, because in the end there is an opportunity of trillion-dollar industries. Just to finish that off, if you just take 20 gigatons at a carbon price of $100, you just pick that is a $2 trillion per year industry. So what we have ahead of us is a challenge, but it's also one of the biggest opportunities that we have in changing the way business is done.
Brilliant, thank you, Peter. And now, great segue to Brendan, who needs to run to another engagement. Peter's point about financing is absolutely critical. You're one part of that puzzle. Love to hear your views on this in terms of obstacles and opportunities, and if it's possible for you to talk a little bit about what would take this into the mainstream commercial banks.
So I think the good news is that all three of the things I'll highlight are already happening. I just think that they need to be accelerated. The three drivers that have compelled the real estate industry to decarbonize just in the last few years are: one, cost of capital; two, local regulation; and three, private sector demand for space. And I think all of them can be accelerated. Let's start with cost of capital. So real estate is truly a cost of capital driven business. Basically, buildings are just physical bonds. And so if the cost to finance those assets changes, which it is, because large capital allocators like BlackRock, major insurance companies, major REIT equity buyers are saying, we will preferentially deploy capital to low or no carbon footprint real estate. In so changing the cost of capital, it's creating huge incentives for real estate owners to decarbonize. That's already happening, and I think that we're just going to continue to see more of that. The second is around regulation, and so while events like this, like COP, focus a lot on kind of the international dynamics of decarbonization, inherently real estate is taxed and regulated locally, not nationally or internationally, certainly. And so we're much more focused on local regulation. So for example, under the Trump administration, where the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement, a number of cities in the US put themselves right back in at a local level. So for example, there's Local Law 97 in New York, which contemplates carbon fines based on square footage for commercial assets. I think those are going to come on the docket in just about every city in the United States over the next decade. And as they do, as those carbon fines start to get priced into assets, they'll change the indifference point where a real estate owner is willing to make a bet on technology to reduce their CO2 emissions. So that's already happening, and I think you'll continue to see more of that. And the last is private sector. So, certainly at events like this, you hear a lot of large corporations making very bold, very ambitious net zero claims. And typically when they do that, they're talking about their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And most people don't reflexively think of real estate as a supplier to, for example, Amazon. But actually the real estate industry is one of the biggest suppliers to Amazon in the form of industrial warehouses and intermodal facilities and offices and data centers. And so what's starting to happen, and I think you'll see more of, is that as companies commit to decarbonizing, they're only going to leave space from real estate owners that adhere to much stricter criteria And so if you can't lease space to Amazon as a landlord, it doesn't matter whether you are a climate denier or not, you're going to decarbonize. The good news is all three of these things are happening already, and it's probably what accounts for why real estate has kind of taken center stage in the climate debate. But I think you'll just see, further acceleration of all three.
Thank you, and that's so exciting when we look at the US with the Securities Exchange Commission draft that's out too. That I think could have another big impact in terms of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So, fantastic summary. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure having you on the panel. We know you need to run. Please leave us all your cards, and we look forward to following with great interest what you're doing. So, Katya, may I come to you and ask you what you see, obstacles and opportunities? And I'd love it if you could go into a little more detail on cooling in particular, because with this inverse sort of feedback loop, knowing that people are in need of more and more cooling as the planet gets hotter, that becomes a bigger challenge. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. There is a great opportunity also from the private sector perspective. Air conditioning is expected to largely increase in the coming years, with the stock level increasing by between 2 and 4 folds by 2050. So that's really a huge increase. And also commercial refrigeration will increase. So there's really a great potential here. And private, the main drivers in the region, talking about in the MENA region, which is one of the hottest we have here globally, are the growth of population, also new urbanization and new settlements, and also the higher affordability. So all this will really increase the cooling demand in the region, with an expected increase in appliances needed. Having these technologies available for the local manufacturer, this is really a unique position also at global market, and also if not active at global market, also for the for local market, they really gain a good opportunity to be kind of first movers in the market, to also acquire larger share at local market. And also, not to forget, is also to establish consumer trust to these new technologies. So these are more or less the opportunities for the private sector, but there are still some challenges they are facing. So our manufacturers we work with, they always emphasize that they really need a regulatory framework that really enable the transition to sustainable cooling development. This is really still needed at local as well as regional level. Also, we need more financial mechanism that also support the transition. Another important point for the manufacturer is to have training and capacity building, in particular for the technicians handling natural refrigerants and the appliances in installation and operation maintenance, but also safely disposal. And more awareness raising measures is needed among the consumers, because they have to buy and use new technologies, and there is still some resistance. For example, the discussion on flammability of natural refrigerants in the market, and you really have to build up trust in these new technologies to be bought. And so additionally, awareness raising measures are also needed in this context.
Thank you, that was a wonderful summary. And I'm excited to share, if you haven't heard already, that climate education is going to be a pillar of COP28. So Katja, your point about awareness raising, capacity building, training, UNESCO has just published the results of their survey, which was almost 20,000 people worldwide, and 70% said that they didn't understand climate change, they couldn't explain it. So this is pretty scary when we're looking at that bigger sample size, but very important to raise awareness. And I have to admit, I did not know about these technologies until I met Peter and Gus. So I think, having run the development agency for New Zealand and being very aware as our primary clients for the Pacific Islands, who of course have been talking about climate for some time, it was not on my radar as a senior bureaucrat. And your point about the regulatory environment and creating incentives is a very good one. And of course that brings us back to you, Brian, having compared the regulatory environment in Canada and the US. What do you see from your vantage point as the trends in global decarbonisation and our opportunities and obstacles?
So I think I've got 3 points to make. The first one is, and this is very much in contrast to Canada and the United States, but it's more a case of where the same thing is happening. There tends to be attention drawn to, generation or, buildings, or as opposed to looking at the whole, or transportation. There doesn't seem to be sort of an appropriate weighting of focus on each of the areas. So I think until there starts being a little bit more of an even-handed approach, one area that is absolutely neglected, and I think worldwide, is can the grids take electrification? And most people in industry would say that's a massive, massive challenge that's not being addressed. So I think all of these areas need to be addressed, more even-handedly than they are today.
Could you give us a little more detail on that? When you say the grids, can they actually absorb the electrification?
In many places, you can't have more than 2 electric cars on a block, or the system will fail. Because the systems have not been built to take that kind of a demand of electricity. And there's some different technological approaches that make that a little easier, but the fact of the matter is that most of the grids were developed with an expectation of more current demand, more current requirements, and they are just not built to take it. So that's one of the areas where it's generally been neglected, and there needs to be a lot of work done there to ensure that as things become electrified, that we will be able to not have system failures over and over again. So the other point I wanted to make is when you look at globalization and trying to really move forward on carbon reduction. And when we've had it in Alberta for 15 years, is a carbon tax. There's nothing that moves technology development, moves industry to respond to decarbonization as much as a carbon tax. And it is very much, you can look at it as a threat, or you can look at it as an opportunity. And I think those countries and those organizations that see it as an opportunity, it's huge, because it drives a lot of thinking, a lot of development, a lot of science, and very, very positive. The other thing is, and we as a company have a philosophy that the real answer to decarbonization is all of the above. It's it's not just, there isn't 1 or 2 or 3 silver bullets. It's actually almost everything in every area we're going to need to do to reach, getting to only 1.5 degrees by 2050. It's a massive undertaking, and it takes technological focus in every area for us to get there.
That is a wonderful wrap up to our panel. It's not one silver bullet. It's going to take a raft of things, from the new technologies coming out, the work being done in universities, having a conducive regulatory framework. And we heard today, if we had $100 price on carbon universally, we'd be there. So the training and capacity building, the awareness raising, education, finance, And then the practicalities, as you so rightly said, to make sure that there are not system failures with current technologies like the grid. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our absolutely brilliant panelists. This has been an amazing session. I was wondering how we were going to get through on a Saturday evening, but in fact, it has been an absolutely inspirational event. We will make time for questions too, but please join me in a round of applause. Does anybody have a question or a comment that they would like to make? Yes, please. Would you like to bring you a mic? If you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us where you're from, and then ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Nora, and I'm from the Global CCS Institute. For those who aren't aware of us, we are a global think tank on CCS. So I have a couple of questions. So my first was about the really fascinating technology that was presented. And, you know, in CCS, we always talk about CCS's capability of decarbonizing steel and cement, but this seems to be a replacement for steel and cement, which is very exciting. But I was wondering what the timescales were, kind of as the development, you know, grows. So I was wondering if there's any thinking and research on that. And my second question is on, we were talking a bit on nature-based solutions, and I understand that reducing carbon dioxide is definitely a global imperative, but there's also, I feel like, something that's kind of flying under our radar, and that's sort of a technology the technology found in soil, and the fact that the organic carbon content of soil is degrading to the point where our food systems will fall in the next 40 years. So I'm wondering how we're going to kind of bring all these things together, and if there's any thinking around that within the panel as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. The global cement industry and the global steel making alone will eat up almost everything of the remaining CO2 budget to keep the 1.5 degrees. So we need to address these materials. That is a mandatory fact. So if you ask me what our dreams are, we would like to replace steel and cement immediately. But we cannot scale it up quickly enough. Also, we have to admit and recognize that the cement making is currently needed to bring a lot of people into homes. And so we have been thinking about some bridging technology, some ideas how to join the old world of materials and the new one. And the pouring of CO2 into cement may be a good idea. It will take about 10 years, I believe, until we know if this really works and to what extent it will work. It will be a very fascinating method to bring CO2, at least for a period of time, into these building materials. The problem is the environment of this cement with a lot of CO2 and a lot of more oxygen inside is not suitable to be stabilized with steel, because the environment is so sour, the steel will rust immediately. So the cement industry is talking about these solutions, but they don't have a solution for the reinforcement. And here comes us, because our material can be cut into small slices, and the granite is able to bridge the non-fitting thermal expansion coefficients. That is so good that in current reinforced concrete making, that steel and concrete have the same thermal expansion. So if the material is exposed to temperature change day and night, they move together. They get longer and shorter and longer and shorter. They do not disrupt on the surface. So if you bring other materials like the carbon fibers, for example, into the concrete alone, this will not be a solution. Since carbon fiber is the only solution to replace the steel in cement, because other fibers will not work, because they also don't like the a high oxygen content, like glass fibers, for example, or granite fibers. We came up with the idea to mantle the carbon fiber into two slices of stone. And the stone, since it is, if you may, is so flexible. The stone is so flexible. The stone has a flexibility and specific weight of aluminum. No one knows it. No one has ever discovered this.
And we're seeing it now.
You see it now, and this is not breaking. We can prove it in 1 million bending cycles. This material is not losing any stiffness. The stone is the game changer. The stone manages a lot of things that we cannot solve with other materials. And the stone is a bio-based base material. And the next question is scalability. If we have enough CO2 to make the carbon fibers, even with hydrogen, it's possible to make carbon fibers from CO2. Hydrogen and CO2, we get methanol. From the methanol, we can make carbon fibers. There is no limit. There is no availability problems. And the stone, we are often asked by many civil engineers, how many stones are there? How many stones do you have? Stone is 100 times more available than limestone. Cement is made from it today. We even can stabilize the cheap limestone with carbon fibers, like this piece here. And why would we crush it and bring down the pressure stability of the limestone that is 2 to 3 times higher than the concrete into a form that costs a lot of money, a lot of grinding, electricity, energy, and not use it as it is. So we can use limestone, we can use granite, and especially the black granites are very well suitable for the weathering of stone, and that is suitable to fertilize together with biochar soil. And since we heard from Mr. Schlosser and in another side event yesterday, Professor Uwe Arnold from Berlin, together with the Potsdam people working in this CDR Terra project, pointed out that biochar will be the largest source to capture from a natural way CO2. And we can bring this to soil if we mix it with the powder of the waste of our products here. So scalability is not the issue. The only issue is that we are in the beginning, and we need investment to scale this up.
I'll invest.
Yes, you're welcome. So how fast can that go? I mean, it depends on the world, how fast the world wants to change. Yeah, why don't we start today, and then it can go very fast. So we actually use the COP here to team up with a lot of countries worldwide to bring the idea to India, to Brazil, to many international places at once, and see how this can grow.
It seems to me a partnership with Brendan and his fund would be a really great outcome of this panel. It's a shame he's gone. We'll have to write to him. But given the venture capital into the real estate market and this fabulous product, that's very exciting. May I add something on the nature-based solutions? So Elemental Accelerator out of Honolulu, which is funded by Lorene Powell Jobs, Steve Jobs' wife, invests in these new climate solutions. And there's a new one, which is a nature-based solution of basically weathering rock called Vesta. And they're doing olivine sands, which then permanently sequesters the carbon, but can also be used by islands as a buffer for rising sea levels. So that was one I just discovered a couple of weeks ago that I thought was fascinating as a nature-based solution also. Did anyone else on the panel want to add? Peter?
Yeah, on the food system, there is, of course, a limitation to nature-based solutions, and because of the food system. I mean, we all hear about the $1 trillion tree initiatives, etc. There's only so much biomass that we can add to the planet without without compromising the food supply, but also there will be a limit period in terms of the area that you can afforest, etc., just from climatic reasons. So we do need a mixture of methods to put carbon away, put it to use, put it away as waste, or turn it into biomass. In terms of speed and reaching the goals, it's probably easier to start with nature-based solutions because we know how to do that. But then at some point we have to come in with the technology-based solutions because we are reaching that buffer that we can fill with, in essence, organic material.
Thank you so much. Another point about sequestration of carbon in soils. There's been a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture, and we know that nitrogen fertilizers have been quite a problem in terms of, which is what you pointed out, in terms of the nutrition going back into food. And there's now better methodology to measure carbon in the soils. There's still a lot of research going on, but I think that that is another area that people are looking at to be able to accredit and say, well, we know that this particular ecosystem, as opposed to monocrop, in this ecosystem is sequestering X amount of carbon. And we're also doing research at that, on that at ASU. There's a gentleman called Peter Bick who has been working with farmers across the US, and there's a series coming out soon about that. So if you see me afterwards, I can give you those details too. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, in the front row, if you could introduce yourself too, please.
Hi, yes. Hi everyone, my name is Hala Lugdani. I graduated from the University of Arizona, Tucson, not the Sun Devils. And I wanted to ask, well, first of all, I want to thank the panelists for sharing all of the amazing technologies that you mentioned today. I definitely understand cooling in MENA because it's so hot in here, and we definitely are reliant on air conditioning, so we definitely need new technologies to help us mitigate emissions while still cooling and not being able to melt. But I had a few comments on DAC as well as the CCS program of Alberta. I've listened to a lot of panelists over the past few days talk about CCS, and a lot of them believe in the technology to help us get to reducing emissions or to reach net zero emissions, but a lot of them were saying that it's economically expensive. So I wanted to ask Brian, is what helping Canada get these solutions up and running, is it the carbon tax that you mentioned previously? And I also wanted to quickly ask about DAC. My limited knowledge of direct air capture is that it's hard to scale up because of the concentrations of CO2 in the air, as well as the different methodologies that you can capture CO2 in it. I see how marvelous this discovery is of adding stone to carbon fibers in the whole cycle, but how feasible is it to get your CO2 out of direct air capture versus other easier methods where you can get higher concentrations of CO2? Thank you again.
So sure, there's no doubt CCS is expensive, and there's other technologies in time that I think, if we were making a decision in 10 years as to what we're going to do with emissions from natural gas, we'd probably have a different answer. But I think the fact of the matter, and this is one of the good things that's been happening over the last year or 2 years, is that right now CCUS is the only answer. Canada has taken a position that there is no way that they will meet their 2030 targets without some significant deployment of CCUS, period. And so it's in many respects, some can look at it and say, well, it's not the best ultimate solution, but it's a solution that's available today. And certainly the carbon tax regime very much helps the implementation of CCUS.
In the DACUS project, we are at the beginning to collect all data to actually give the answer to your question. So at the moment we are collecting these data and we cannot release any data from that is impossible. But at the end of this year we are able to deliver. And then I could answer the question about the cost of the direct air capture to you. But everything is related to cost. That's correct. Efficiency and cost. So what I can say for this material, the energy need to produce this is about half of that of steel or concrete making. So that gives us a big gain to invest in other parts of the process chain once they're not so efficient in the beginning, to shift money to across the process chain, because we know that we need to be at the same price level than cement and concrete, otherwise it's impossible to enter the market. That is clear. So yeah, the answer is we can provide you with that information towards the end of next year. Let's say this year, that's not correct, end of next year. So that the project is still going on for another year.
Just a quick addition. It is expensive, but we have littered the atmosphere with CO2. We have to clean it up. So there's no way around it. If you look at the costs in the global context, full decarbonization will take about 2, maybe 3% of the global GDP. That's a price we have to pay for having, quote unquote, sinned in the past. There's just no way around that. Now, taking that and looking at the numbers we need to reach, roughly 20 gigatons by 2050, so it will build up. That's more than in this industry can actually be used. I think at some point you have so much that has to come out of the atmosphere that with all the use cases that we can envision at that point, we still have to put some of it away, like in a waste industry. So I think that the supply problem a few years from now will not be an issue for producing other materials. The cost, we are often now focusing in on $100 per ton. At scale, there are estimates that the carbon price could actually, if you are reaching the gigaton extraction level, that the technology would drop down to about $50 a ton. Still not negligible, but this is simply, we have mistreated the planet, we have to clean it up, and that's a price to pay. And in the grand scheme of things, that's not an extraordinary price to pay to get back on track.
Thank you. And one final statistic to leave you with. IMF data for 2020, $5.9 trillion, trillion with a T, in fossil fuel subsidies, both implicit and explicit. So the cost of green transition, about 1 to 3 trillion a year. So we come back, the question is an excellent one. Current economic framework is so skewed towards this very old-fashioned, as Peter says, polluting model, where we're actually funding our own demise. It makes no sense. And all of the points that our panel have made so brilliantly today are all of the elements that we need, but we mustn't also forget, fundamentally, we need to be transparent about the fossil fuel subsidies and the need for a polluter pays regime. I want you to thank again our wonderful panelists, and thank you so much to the audience for being here. Absolutely.